Hi, my friends. Okay, we're going to continue our discussion of Egypt, but before we go um, to the end of the first intermediate period, and to the Middle Kingdom, I want us to cover the early dynastic period and the Old Kingdom period of Egypt in this session, right? Continue with our discussion of that. Now, I want you to remember, and we're going to go into this. One of the first things that I want you to keep in mind about the early dynastic period, right, is the fact that Upper and Lower Egypt are united during this dynastic period. I think I'm going to make it like some cooler color. Let's see, like this one. Okay, so I'm sorry. So during the early dynastic period, first of all, you have the creation of nomes or provinces, and you have the Upper and Lower Egypt united. When we get to the Old Kingdom period, one of the things that I want you to remember is that the major elements of the Egyptian civilization are fully developed, right, during the Old Kingdom period, namely their writing, namely their religious beliefs, right, their monumental architecture, their trade, and obviously the prosperity that comes with it, and the notion of kingship, right, and the political structure that is established in Egypt, right. So these are the issues that we will be discussing, right, in this session. So to begin with, right, we start by the early dynastic period, right? So we are told the story, right, about the early dynastic period, and that is the fact that there was a legendary king in the history of Egypt in the early dynastic period, right, which was called King Namer. Which was called King Menes, right? And it was King Menes, right, that united, right, Upper Egypt with Lower Egypt in order to make of Egypt um, the the sort of the very sort of essence of its political structure, and that is the centralization that takes place as a result of the coming together and of Lower and Upper Egypt under what originally we thought was a legendary king. But later on, we figured out that no, this legendary king might actually be the King Namer of the first dynasty, right? Who lived around 3100 BCE, right? So King Namer, who lived around 3100 BCE. And the reason we know of King Namer is that we found, right, in the 19th century, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we found what became known as the Narmer or Namer plates. This is there is a typo here, my friend. Narmer or Namer. There is no R anymore here. Plate, right? Or palette rather, right? The Namer. Nomer Nomer palette, right? Okay, so what is the Nomer palette? The Nomer palette depicts on its on the two sides of it, the king of what we presume to be King Namer himself, right? That and King Namer is standing next to the symbolism for God, for the god Horus, right? Which is one of the main gods of Egyptians. And on the one side of it, you see there is an attendant that is following the king. You see that the king has a particular sort of headgear that we will get to in a second. And you see that there is the king is sort of vanquished, has vanquished an enemy, right? With his left hand, and you see that basically all the depictions, and you see Horus, right? You see God Horus on what is here, the fields of papyrus, sort of papyrus plants, right? And you see that King Horus is also sort of killing someone, by its right hand, right, killing someone here. So this is a victory. Sort of palette, in other words, right? It's a victory palette showing the victories of King Namer, right? And on this side of the on the reverse side of the palette, right? You see that there are two attendants, sort of bringing the heads of two fantastical creatures together, right? And where the horns of the sort of these creatures, right, create a sort of space, a circular space here, right, which has a little bit of depth. And we were wondering what exactly this sort of this whole design and mechanism is created here, right? Why is that there? And then we realized that, okay, the number palette actually was in the pre-dynastic period of Egyptian history, right? I mean, history, that's the benefit of history, right? That is cumulative, right? So you see that in the prehistory of the dynastic period, right? Pre-dynastic period of Egyptian civilization, where the elements for the creation of the dynastic period are becoming clear. You see that there is a cosmetic palette, right? There's a cosmetic palette that the pre-dynastic Egyptians used for grounding cosmetics, right? And this is called the four dog palettes. And lo and behold, where is it held again? It is held in the museum of one of the colonial powers of 19th century, i.e. the Egyptians, right? It is in the Louvre, right? So we see that what becomes the Namer palette, right? And this is one side of it. You see that the depictions are all the depictions of of victory and vanquishing of the god and of the king in this case. And you see that here the attendant is carrying sort of sandals of the king and a basket in his two hands, right? And you realize that this must be some kind of a ritual that is being enacted here. Probably King Namer himself, right, is is performing some rituals itself, right? We found this Namer palette, and in the Namer palette we see that the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt become united, right? The crown of Upper Egypt, right, are the upper crown, right, or Hejet, right, has the shape that it has, right, the crown of Upper Egypt, right, i.e. Southern Egypt, and this is the crown of Lower Egypt, right, and once King Namer has united these together, right, the crown becomes symbolically, it represents the signs of Upper and Lower Egypt, right, and becomes the crown that the kings wear from here on, right, in Egypt, right, the sort of double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, right, which becomes like this, right, the depiction. This is the double crown again, along with some specimen of hieroglyphics, right, which we will talk about later. Yeah. So okay, my friends. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind, therefore, is that in the dynastic period, some notion of kingship has developed already. And this notion of kingship that has developed, one of the elements of this notion of kingship is that it has united, right, both Upper and Lower Egypt, i.e. both Lower and Upper Egypt are under the control of one king, right? One king. This kind of a situation, right, which, as we talked about, has to do with the natural conditions, right, in which Egyptian society finds itself, right, lends itself to what kind of a political structure? To a centralized, right, political structure that is under one king, right? So the dynastic period of Egyptian history, right, leads to the notion that there is one king, and we will see what this one king and what are the other elements of the character of this one king, right, that has united Upper and Lower Egypt under a very because of a very sort of reliable river, right, that also lends itself to this centralization. And this is, my friends, unlike the conditions of Mesopotamia, right? So again, one of the lessons that we learn in comparing the Mesopotamian society to the Egyptian society, right? We realize that there was not one king in the Mesopotamian society, right? Mesopotamian society, but there were many kings, right? Many kings. And because there were many many city-states, right? Uh, and there was not one unified kingship with a centralized state. Mesopotamian society lent itself to diversity, to many cities with many sort of different at times characteristics. Of course, all of them shared the elements of civilization that we had talked about, and we remember that with the case of the Mesopotamian society, right? It was only with the coming of of the Akkadians and Sargon the Great, right? That we get sort of some semblance of centralization, some semblance of having a larger territory under its control, and so on and so forth, right? So to continue our story, my friends, right? We This was the situation in our sort of dynastic period, right? We have to remember as well that it is during this dynastic period that many sort of nomes or provinces are created, right? Nomes, NOMES, my friends, right? Many nomes are created, and sort of they are connected to each other, become connected to each other through the efforts of one of the first kings of the first dynasty, namely King Namer, right? Excuse me. So, okay, so then, moving on, we get to the Old Kingdom of Egyptian society. And as you remember, we talked about this, that it is in the Old Kingdom, right, that all the major elements of civilizational elements, so to speak, of the Old Kingdom comes to the fore and is established, right? One of the we are moving from the economics to the other aspects of this Old Kingdom, and one of the important things that you have to remember is that the preconditions that was created, right, by King Namer, right, in centralizing Egypt and connecting lower and upper and lower Egypt together meant that once you have control of upper Egypt, i.e. southern Egypt, right, you can get your neighbor, you're getting close, very close to your southern neighbor, the equally sort of important civilization of Nubia, right? Once you get to Nubia, and we will see it on our maps, right? Nubia being where Sudan is here, right? Once you get there, then you have access to the resources, the rich resources, not only of Nubia, right? And we will get to the resources of Nubia, but because of Nubia, of the resources, you gain access to the resources of sub-Saharan Africa, right? So what it means is that the trade of sub-Saharan Africa and the goods and the riches of sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Nubia, right, now are moving, so to speak, with the Nile, right, from the sources of the Nile, right, in Ethiopia and Nubia, right? What was Nubia at that point, right? Towards the Mediterranean, right? Moving upwards towards the Mediterranean, and therefore the riches of Africa reaching the lands, the lands surrounding, right? Surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, right? As we will see, for instance, much later on, as far as the Greeks were concerned, right? That exchange, that economic exchange, has already it drew its roots right in the old kingdom, and that sort of amassing of the riches of Africa, and the trade between Africa and quote unquote, well, let's say northern parts of the Mediterranean Sea and the eastern parts of the Mediterranean Sea, and as we will see later on with the rise of the Phoenicians, with Western Mediterranean, right? That whole sort of connectivity, right? As was the case with the Mesopotamian society and trade, connecting it to the Syrian regions and the Arabian regions and the Zagros regions and whatnot, right? In the Egyptian society, you get the whole of Africa, so to speak, at this period of Old Kingdom, the resources of the whole of Africa moving kind of northwards. And what is coming from inside of Africa and Nubia? Well, a lot of riches, right? There is gold, there is ivory, there is ebony, there is precious gems and aromatics, right? And of course exotic animals as well, not to forget the exotic animals of Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, right? Also luxury goods, mind you, right? Because they're exotic in one part of the world. They're and therefore they're exotic. I mean, they exist in one part of the world, and they're but not in others. Therefore, they become exotic for others, right? And those were gifts that kings gave them each other as well. Okay, so now you see, this is the way we have our sort of map of Egypt, right? At this period, during this period, you realize therefore that also the lower Nubia, right? Lower Nubia corresponds to Upper Egypt, right? And again, Upper Nubia, right, is in the south, right? Because it is closest to the source of the Nile, right? So this is the map of the of Egypt, right, under the sort of old kingdom, so to speak, my friends, right, and the movements of goods and riches of Africa, and of course the other way of the Mediterranean, but not much comes this from the Mediterranean itself, except for the Eastern Mediterranean, which we will get to in a second, right? So okay, so that's as far as the trade, right? Of the trade connections of ancient Egypt is concerned, right? And you see there that we have already our nomes, right? And provinces of of Egypt, right? In Upper Egypt and in Lower Egypt, you see that the delta is dotted with these, with these sort of nomes and or provinces, which are of course agriculturally rich, extremely rich, right? Because of the flooding of the Nile and the regular flooding of the Nile and the time that the Nile floods, right? In June, when it is time with it, when you are planting already your seeds, and this beautiful flood comes, bringing with it all kinds of nutrients and whatnot to make of your gnomes, right, rich agricultural lands, and you see you see that there is a capital city created, the city of Memphis, and I would like you to keep in mind this Saqqara that we will get into later, right? So again, here you see the nomes of Upper and Lower Egypt, right? Yeah, and I want you to keep in mind, right? First of all, I want you to recall Thebes, where Luxor and Karnak are, and we will get to those later as well. And I want you to keep in mind that of the cataracts, right? And you realize where is the first cataract, right? Shortly before the first cataract, right? White Nile and Blue Nile, right, are joined to make the Nile, right? This is Blue Nile. Sorry. Okay, my friends. This is the White Nile and Blue Nile, which join each other here at Khartoum, right? Yeah. So we will get to these cataracts also later. Yeah, and we will talk about it. Incidentally, my friends, I realized that like in our last session, I talked, instead of saying the 3rd century, right, of the Egyptian writer who wrote the history of Egypt, right? Menace, right? Instead of saying 3rd century, I said 3rd millennium. So please pay attention. I mean, and don't recognize once. If you recognize these slight sort of mistakes, because that cannot be sort of rectified in that session itself. So okay, my friends. So here was our gnomes, right? And the Egyptian trade, right, gives you access to resources of sub-Saharan Africa. And what did Egyptians give sub-Saharan Africa? Egyptian clothes and manufactured goods, right? Egypt, like Mesopotamia, needed wood, and of course, like Mesopotamia, right, they needed wood, for instance, for making vessels, for trade and navy, right? So this wood, of course, they would get from the cedar trees, right, of where you already know this, cedar trees of Lebanon and Syria, right? So that's as far as trade goes, of course, what you have to remember that the trade means the establishment. Having a solid trade means you have solid trading cities. You have merchants, right, and traders. You have craftsmen, right, um, craftsmen, right, in your cities, right? You have industries that are trade. You have your agriculture is agri. Your agriculture is generating wealth and feeding your cities, and your cities in turn are generating wealth through their trade, right, and through other services and goods that they provide for urban and agricultural populations alike. So, right? So, Old Egypt, when we talk about Old Egypt, we have to remember prosperity, great prosperity, right? Um, and the close knit community, right? That is living under the political authority of what? A divine king, right? So here you get the idea in Egypt that your kings, the very kings themselves are divine, right? They are gods, right? They are gods, and unlike the again, unlike the Mesopotamian kings who are only representative of gods, right? So, and what is just in the Egyptian society, right? Order is just, right? Order is justice, right? Brings with it justice, right? If the Nile floods regularly, right, it will ensure prosperity, which in turn ensures wealth, right, and happiness for all the community. So there is as a result, your justice is created, and there is such a thing called truth, right? Yet something, some, that you already get, right? In other words, you already get the abstract articulation, right? Abstract articulation of what is just, what is justice, right? And you developed the concept of ma'at, right? Which is again truth, justice, and ordered. Yeah, and so you create an ordered society, a just society that is ruled obviously by a divine king who ought to be just, right? That and this divine king is later on in your history called a pharaoh, right? And that has to be OH, right? Which means a great house, right? A great house. Later on in Egyptian history, right? The notion of pharaohs is actually a later the nomenclature is a later nomenclature, right? So this we have not talked about this, and I will talk about this. But one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that what for Egyptian society was the notion of ma'at and justice, right? In the later on in the Indo-European societies, right, becomes the concept of erta or arta, right, which is again the concept of justice and divine order, and ordered society where you have, where truth rules, where justice rules, right, my friends? So again, a sort of cautionary note, right, about about our presentist conceptions, right? And we think that we have the monopoly, we have created the monopoly to justice and truth and whatnot only in the modern world, right? Think again, my friends, right? This conception of justice has actually a lot, an ancient sort of use, right? So you get to the old kingdom, right? Prosperity, of course, prosperity has to come to families, right? So you have the closely knit families that are support for each other. For instance, in your book, you get the the example of the family of Seneb and Senites, right, and their family from the um, basically 2600s, yeah, BCE, 2500s BCE, right, and you see that the husband Seneb, right, is probably a dwarf, right? But you see that he has married, right, to a sort of non-dwarf woman, right? So and you see that their children are under their gaze. You see smiles on their faces, right? From the fact that that Seneb is a dwarf, right? Yet has married, a rather beautiful woman here, right? You get the feeling that Seneb, right, must have been himself of high credentials and high status, and we know that he was a nobility. He was a nobility in one of the Egyptian pharaohs' sort of palace, right? And you think that therefore a nobility also marries a nobility, a noble woman. So this is a noble family, and the way you can tell the children, right, in that the fact that they you can tell that they're children by the fact that they are holding their fingers in front of their faces. Yeah, this was also a sort of artistic depiction, regular artistic depiction of the Egyptian artistry, right? So you have the notion of kingship, you have your urbanization, you have developed a complicated sort of system of religious thought, abstract religious thought, right? And that is the notion of ma'at and justice. And you have to keep in mind that yeah, for the Egyptian society, right? Right, and then forget about that, my friends. Just the whole notion of the family, right? Urbanization, family, abstractification of spiritual thought, right? In terms of ma'at and whatnot, and then you begin to get your writing, right? You begin to get your writing. Writing, we said that it was hieroglyphics, right? Hieroglyphics, right? I.e., sacred writing. Of course, it was used for all kinds of other purposes as well, right? For accounting, Egyptian societies needed the same systems of everything that we talked about as far as Egyptian, as far as Mesopotamian society is concerned, right, applies also to the Egyptian society. Uh, therefore, writing was meant for all kinds of purposes, for accounting, for bookkeeping, for calculating and whatnot. But was also sort of sacred writing, right? Sacred writing. Therefore, you can tell that with hieroglyphics, right? The complicated nature of hieroglyphics, right, became the business of scribes in Egyptian society, right? Therefore, the scribes were one of the highest echelons of Egyptian society. And in fact, because the writing was so cumbersome, right? Because the script, so to speak, I mean, the writing was so cumbersome, not that many people had access to it, right? But it was not just hieroglyphics, right, that we talk about as far as Old Kingdom is concerned. Yeah, the system of writing of the Egyptians, yeah, you could, in hieroglyphics, basically, you could excuse me, portray an object, right? That makes it a pictograph. You can render an abstract idea, right? An abstract idea, i.e., an ideogram, right? Or one or more sounds of speech, right? Which would be the phonogram, right? As hieroglyphics were too cumbersome for everyday use, it gradually, right, developed into hieratic, right, or simplified scripts to keep records or to write. So you see that another very important, right, again, element of civilization and an ancient heritage that we get, right, of being able to write, right, is comes from another one of our river valley societies, as opposed to the reeds, as you recall, we talked about in Mesopotamian societies, the symbol of Upper Egypt, right? And in fact, the land of Upper Egypt was the land of papyrus plants, which look the way that you see in your picture in front of you, right? And the symbol, therefore, of Upper Egypt became the papyrus plants that you saw underneath of god Horus, right? That was depicted on the Namer plant, right? So here, for instance, in Dynasty 18th, from the much later period, right, you have a rendition of men, right, and men sort of gathering papyrus, uh, sort of papyrus trees, right, and splitting it, right, for various purposes that they needed to split, right, and you see again, it is we are keeping it in Metropolitan Museum. We have specimen of art that deal with sort of this mode of life, right? And this extremely important source of Egyptian source for Egyptian societies for a multiplicity of purposes, right? Including including the papyrus on which you wrote, right? The papyrus on which you wrote, right? And one of the sort of positive elements of papyrus is that, of course, the climate in Egypt is dry, right? Hardly any rainfall, right? So that the papyra, right? Papyra have survived for us, right? To this day from ancient Egyptian societies. So here you get, for instance, examples of ideograms, right? An idea that you represent a house, right? And the idea of rejoicing, the idea of a man, the idea of wheat, of course, to weep, you see, to sow seeds, to sail up the river, right? Osiris the king, the god, to plow that body, again, your king, your field, and your grains, right? And so on and so forth, to make an offering, and the Nile, right? The Nile, yeah. So this is how you render your ideograms, and then you get your phonograms, right? Depicted with the sign of a bird, right? And so on and so forth. Yeah. So moving on, ultimately you get your hieroglyphic alphabet, right? Which again, it becomes more simplified, right? So, we used to sort of try to learn elementary Egyptian, right? And that is very easy, right? The man, the woman, you have to be a good drawer, sort of. The boat, right? The sun, okay, you don't need to be an artist for depicting the sun or the water, but even an eye, I think it's kind of artistic. Okay, my friends, so this is elementary Egyptian, but intermediate Egyptian, already it gets a little bit complicated, right? Because a sign can stand for a number of things, right? To eat, to drink, to speak, right? The sign for air, wind, sail. So you have to figure that from the context, right? And then you wrote, of course, not only on papyra, right, but you wrote on the stones, right, of which you have a plenty of in next to you, right? So what else do we get in the Old Kingdom, right? Is this important thought, right, about life continuing after death, right? And the whole notion of believing in an afterlife, right? Believing in an afterlife, right? In other words, to have when you believe in an afterlife, death becomes momentary for you, right? As in Christianity, for instance, or any other sort of complicated religious system, right? Where you begin to think of the fact that life is one phase, but afterlife is certainly another phase, and it's a long-lasting phase, right? And you see that it is the Christian belief, it is the Jewish belief, and of course, separately there is in the Indo-European belief a whole separate system develops, right? So important contribution, right, of the notion of afterlife as opposed to the Mesopotamian notion of the world of the dead, right? So because you develop this notion of afterlife, right, you you prepare yourself for your afterlife, right? In so in many respects, right? But in terms of a life after death, right? You will have what if you have a life after death, right? You will need the same kind of life as the cases in Egyptian society, an ordered life, and a life where ma'at, right, is the only thing that rules, right? And you would not have an intermediate period, as you will see, right, in your history where everything becomes chaos, right? But in this afterlife, in the Egyptian afterlife, yeah, life is good, right? Afterlife is good, unless you have been terrible, right, in this life, right? Which is exactly our notion of, what you do affects also your afterlife. But in this case, right, because you have, and so who can afford to create the same conditions of this life, in this life, for their afterlife, right? Obviously, people of wealth, right? As you remember, we saying, discussing, right, my friends, settled society already begins and brings inequality. But the minute you settle, is when you get inequality, right? Because you could accumulate wealth. So, okay, so if you are in a position to accumulate wealth, right, and have a lot of wealth, right, you want to take some of that wealth with you to the afterlife, right? And you are a king in this case because you can afford all the riches of life, right? And you are divine on top of that, right? So your pyramids, right, are cone shaped, right? And as we discussed this before, your king, right, has is lying there, but is reaching to your God, right? Reaching to your God, or yeah, one of the gods. Okay, so you actually don't have the notion of God with big G, right? You have God with small gods with small g. But at any rate, the king is the one who is also divine, right? Nobody else. Um, so, um, So what you do is, you build pyramids, right? In the Old Kingdom, you build your first specimens. You build actually is your Old Kingdom becomes the age of pyramids. Your very first one, advisor to King Djoser, was built by advisor to the King Djoser, who lived in the 27th century BCE in the Old Kingdom in Dynasty 3, right? The first pyramid, remember I told you, remember Saqqara, right, was built in Saqqara. And this is the step period pyramid that we see, right? But then in the Old Dynasty, right, there are other pyramids that are created as well, and this is like specimens of the most important and iconic sort of pyramids of Egypt, yeah, the Giza pyramids, from left to right, right? Pyramid of Mankar, pyramid of Khafre, and the pyramid of Khufu, right, all belonging to the fourth dynasty, right, of Egyptian Old Kingdom period. So, if you want to take your riches, right, to the afterworld, afterlife, right, obviously you want to take not only your soul but your body, right? So there develops, right, this complicated system of embalming and mummification, right, which has an elaborate system where you basically first take out you make a small incision, right, in the lower abdomen and take out all the internal organs of your deceased, and you put it into a sort of and salty sort of liquid, yeah, in order for it to preserve them, and clean them and whatnot, and then dry them and put them in a separate box, right, with your mummy, which by now you have cleaned up and dried up the internal organs, you have sewed it back up, right, and you have sort of wrapped the whole body in cloth, right, and therefore you have embalmed the body and you have mummified your body, and therefore you keep your body intact, right, the way that you see it on your picture here. And then much later on you have basically a rendition of the picture of the pharaoh also on your casket, so to speak. And you're here, you get in the New Kingdom period, right, a coffin and mummy board. That is the way it is, right? So and here we saw the capital, right, of Thebes, right, and the pyramids of Giza and the capital of Memphis, right, and other cities, Abydos, right, and other important Aswan, right, and Nubia, map of Egypt, right, again your Alexandria here, right? So that if you want to compare, my friends, our Old Kingdom, right, at the period of Old Kingdom with the Mesopotamian period, right, we are dealing with Old Kingdom Egypt, or let's say Dynastic and Old Kingdom Egypt correspond to the Sumerian period, right, of Egyptian society, and the coming of the Akkadians, right, and the campaigns of Sargon the Great. So what I want you to remember, right, to recall, right, is that by the time that we get closer to the end of the third millennium BCE, right, you have basically, the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, right, drawing closer to each other. And this is an omen of later things to come, right, my friends? And in fact, as I told you, is the omen of much later things to come, i.e. United Arab, I believe, states that Nasser had wanted to create in 1950s, right? Abdel Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalist, the secular nationalist of Egyptian society, right, wanted to bring the Fertile Crescent together, and his efforts were stymied by powers that were after World War II, right? In between the world wars and during World War II. And that is a fascinating history has a fascinating history of its own, right? So if we, and then we get to the end of the first period, right? One of the important things that happens, right, towards the end of the Old Kingdom period, towards the Old Kingdom period, towards the end of the Old Kingdom period, in the first intermediate period, is that there is climate change, and therefore there is drought in Nubia, right? Drought in Nubia, yeah, means drought in Egypt, right? Means low floods in Egypt, right? And combine that with a number of weak rulers, right? And you get social and political turmoil, right? Weak rulers, you lose your centralization, you become decentralized, right? Meaning what? Once you have a decentralized system, as in Mesopotamia, you have the opportunity for a number of sort of kings or powers to gain strength, right? In this case, in Egypt, you have local lords gaining strength, right? And there is social and political turmoil, right? And I think your book sort of gives the example of a fellow saying everything is filthy, yeah, from during this period. There is no such a thing as clean linen, right? And if I to this day, right, if you want to buy your linen, right, some of you might know that Egyptian cotton linen is considered one of the best, right? At any rate, the linens are not clean these days. The dead are thrown into the river. For a society that has a notion of afterlife, imagine how chaotic it should be for the dead to be thrown in the river. Although mummification and embalmment and all of that was reserved for the kings and later on high nobility, anybody who could afford it, right? But nevertheless, there was a notion of afterlife for everybody, right? And being thrown in the river is not preparing yourself for that afterlife, right? And the ladies of nobility, right, cannot even eat, right? They are forced to prostitute their daughters, right? They themselves are reduced to sleeping with men who were once too badly off to take a woman, right? They would marry anyone, right? Anyway, so this is the end of the first sort of Old Kingdom period, Dynastic, and the Old Kingdom period, where you have all kinds of forces conspiring to make life sort of miserable actually during this period, right? And to create a decentralized society which yeah, covers your 8th and 9th dynasties, right? 9th and 10th dynasties, and as you see here, your 8th dynasty has only control of Upper Egypt, right? Has only control of Upper Egypt here, Upper Egypt, your 8th dynasty, and your 9th and 10th dynasties only have control of Lower Egypt. Yeah, so so that is how things stand at the end of the first intermediate period. Okay, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this session. I will continue with our coverage of Egypt in the next session. And for now, my friends, I bid you all farewell. Bye.